Thank you all for letting me come and share a story with you tonight. Next Thursday is the start of the Florida Storytelling Festival in Mount Dora. Is anyone planning to go at all? Okay, well, Mount Dora is a lovely place and it's a lovely festival. And I am going to be one of the fringe performers next Friday night. And I'll have a 45-minute set, and it's going to be 3 stories that are connected together, but each one stands on its own. So tonight I'm going to tell you the middle of those 3 stories, which is called They Died with Their Boots On. Mary knew that the smartest thing would have been to just not go to the soda shop anymore. Jimmy was back in town, and he and his buddies were hanging out at the soda shop. It was 1950, Buffalo, New York. Mary was 17, a senior in high school. Jimmy was 20 years old, and he was home on leave from the Marines. Actually, the story was that he was finished with his stint in the Marines, but he was going to re-enlist, and he was home while waiting to get called back to Camp Lejeune here in North Carolina. Well, Mary had seen Jimmy a couple of years earlier, again when he was home on leave for a little bit, and his reputation preceded her sighting of him. Jimmy was cute, he was smart, he was funny, he was charming, and he had a ton of girlfriends. And each and every one of those girlfriends, even though they were aware of the others, they were sure, each one was sure she was Jimmy's one and only, his very special girlfriend. And Mary thought that was bizarre, that she would never be one of those girls, even if he was cute and charming. And so Mary decided back then that it would be best if Jimmy didn't even know she existed, you know? And so the best thing now that he was back in town would be to just not go to that soda shop. But Mary didn't want to stop going to that soda shop. And before you nod your heads and go, she had a very good reason. And I'll explain it and then you'll understand. Mary's best friend, Gloria, lived in the apartment over the soda shop. She lived there with her grandmother, and it would be wrong to just stop going and visiting her friend, right? And it would be wrong to not pay her respects to Gloria's grandmother. And so Mary decided that she would keep going to the soda shop and take the risk of Jimmy maybe noticing her. And it worked out okay. Mary would, after school, walk to the soda shop, and then she and Gloria would sit way over onto one side and they'd visit with each other. And then if Jimmy and his buddies came in, they sat way over on the other side. And then everyone else who was there, they would, mosey over there too, where Jimmy held court with his jokes, and the girls would just hang on every word and giggle. And oh, they were so disgusting. But Mary felt comforted that Jimmy had enough attention that he wouldn't be bothering to notice them. And it did work out all right, except for those occasional times when, your eyes, they can't be focused on one thing all the time. Sometimes without you even realizing it, your eyes kind of, scan across the room. And when Mary's eyes would glance to the other side of the store, and Jimmy would be looking at her, and then she'd look away real quick, and it unnerved her, but not that she would let Jimmy see that it bothered her at all. And then she quickly convinced herself that maybe his eyes were just, accidentally roving across the room, and they just happened to meet, and it was in no way that he was staring at her, and so things went on that way, for a while, and then there was this one day that Mary was walking to the soda shop, and Jimmy and his friends were hanging outside of the soda shop, and she was not going to walk by them. She wasn't going to let them look at her or talk to her, but she still wanted to get to the soda shop. So they weren't looking in her direction, and so she quickly squatted down behind a garbage can that was on the sidewalk there. And then she looked, and they weren't looking her way, so she got up and she ran to a storefront that had a recessed doorway, and she scooted into there, and she made herself flush with it so that they wouldn't see her, and then she peeked out, and they weren't weren't looking, and she quickly ran down the sidewalk a little way and hid behind a mailbox that was there. And then she got up and ran to another storefront, and that was how she made her way down the street that day, going from garbage can to storefront to mailbox to storefront, all the way down the street till she got to an alley, which she knew led to the back staircase to Gloria's grandmother's apartment. And as soon as she got to the alley, she scooted in and she had a little victory dance that she had put one over on those guys, that she was going to be inside the soda shop, and they wouldn't have even known how she got there if they had noticed at all. And she was just so thrilled that she had done this. And you know what? She hadn't fooled those guys at all. There was a goofy girl coming down the street hiding behind garbage cans. What was that all about, you know? But Mary thought that she had fooled them. So the next time she was walking down the street and saw the guys hanging out in front of the soda shop, she did the same thing again. She went from garbage can to storefront to a mailbox to the doorway again, all the way down the street she got to the alley, and she scooted in, and one more time she had fooled those guys. And then there was another time she started down the street, and Jimmy's friends were out front. And she couldn't take the chance that Jimmy would show up at any moment, you know, so she did her routine again. She went from garbage can to doorway to mailbox to doorway, all the way down the street till she got to the alley. She ran into the alley, and Jimmy was there. And there was no way that she could convince herself other than he was there for a reason of waiting for her. She was busted. And Jimmy said to her, "Pookie, what are you doing?" Mary was speechless. I mean, not only had she failed in keeping this boy from even noticing her, but he had gone and given her a nickname. Pookie apparently meant she who hides behind garbage cans, you know. And then he said, "Pookie, why don't you talk to me?" Well, Mary found her voice then. She stood up and she sneered at him. She goes, "Why don't you just go talk to all your girlfriends in the soda shop?" And Jimmy turned on the charm and he said, "I don't want to talk to all of them. I want to talk to you." Well, Mary told him what her name was, and that day the two of them walked into the soda shop together, and from then on they were allowed to say hello to each other whenever their paths crossed. And Mary was hoping that that would be the end of it for Jimmy, but that isn't what Jimmy had in mind. "Pookie, you want to go out sometime?" "No." "Pookie, we're all going bowling tonight. Why don't you come on with us?" "No." "Pookie, it's been hot outside. Why don't we go down to the beach tomorrow?" "No." Mary wished that he would stop asking her out. Clearly, he was enjoying the challenge with every time she said no. Mary was sure that another pretty girl would come along any minute and he'd be distracted and then she'd be done with him. But all her friends told her that she probably should go out with him at least once. What's the harm in that? But she knew what the harm in that was. Part of his reputation was that not only did he have all these girlfriends, but he had a habit of asking girls out and then making all the arrangements and everything. And then more often than not, he wouldn't show up. He would stand them all up. And they'd be annoyed momentarily, but then the next time they'd see him, it was as if all was forgiven because that's just the way Jimmy was. And they'd go back to hanging on every word he said and giggling at all of his jokes. And Mary was not going to be one of those girls. In fact, it didn't matter if it was Jimmy or any other boy. No one would ever stand her up and get forgiveness from her. That would be it. It'd be all over, and her friends would understand. And that gave Mary an idea. If she were to say yes to one of Jimmy's suggestions, and then he wouldn't show up because why would she be more special than any of these other girls? And then she'd have a reason to have nothing more to do with him. And whatever this was that was going on between, that would be all over. And so, "Pookie, you want to go to the movies Saturday night?" "Okay." Jimmy was floored. Mary said yes. And he told her that he would come to her place at 7 o'clock that Saturday night, and they would go and see a movie. And both of them were excited. Jimmy was so excited because Mary had finally said yes. And Mary was excited because she knew at some time after 7 o'clock Saturday, this would all be over with, and she could get on with her life, and she could stop putting so much energy into all these defense walls she had around her to protect her from Jimmy. And then as Saturday arrived, Mary was more and more excited. And then as it got closer and closer to the hour, Mary had to admit to herself that at least some of that excitement was in the what if. What if Jimmy actually showed up? At 7 o'clock that night, there was a knock on the door. And Mary and Jimmy walked to the Seneca Theater, and they saw the movie They Died with Their Boots On with Errol Flynn, Jimmy's favorite actor at the time. Their first date. After that, they kept on going on dates. He never stood Mary up. And there were those who called them a couple, but Mary never called them a couple. Mary, she was not investing any emotion into this relationship at all. She had those walls around her. She was just having a good time while it lasted, but it wasn't going to last because some other pretty girl was going to distract Jimmy, and then he'd be gone, and she was braced. She was not going to get her heart broken. They were not a couple. Pookie, will you come watch me play football this Saturday? One thing Mary had learned from dating Jimmy was that he loved football. He watched football, he listened to football, he read football in the sports pages, he knew all the pro teams, the players, the coaches, their records. He lived, breathed, and played football. Somehow he had gotten onto a semi-pro team in the area called the Lackawanna Lakers. Lackawanna is a city just south of Buffalo on the east coast of Lake Erie. Used to be a big steel making town. Nowadays on the shores, lots of windmills blowing around. And Jimmy was on this team. And he asked Mary if she would come and watch him play, and she said, I don't know anything about football. Why would I waste an afternoon looking out at something I know nothing about just because some boy asked me to? And he says, well, I'm the quarterback. She said, means nothing to me. He said, but it would mean something if I knew you were there supporting me. And she looked at him and she said, don't you have a bunch of girlfriends already cheering for you? And he said, well, yeah, there's girls that come and they cheer just for me, but it would only be special if you were there. And Mary said no, she was not going to be one of his cheerleaders, and she did not go to the game. And he asked her every time there was a home game, and every time she gave the same excuse, until it got to be the very last game of the season. Pookie, would you please come watch me play football? It's the last game of the season. I might not make the team next year, and it could be my very last game ever. And Mary gave the same speech she always gave about not knowing anything about football. But this time she said, I have a question for you, and if it's okay, I hope it's not too personal or too, none of your business, but I thought you were going back to the Marines. Aren't you in the Marines? When are you leaving? And that's when Jimmy told her that he wasn't going to re-enlist in the Marines. He said that when he came back to Buffalo, there was something there that made him think maybe he should just stay. There was something that was changing the direction of his life, and he wanted to see how it played out. And at the time when he said that to Mary, she had this slight feeling that maybe he meant her, maybe she's the reason he was staying in town. But she quickly dismissed it and said, it's probably the football. So the day of the game arrived, and then the game started. Mary was at home. But she was feeling all these feelings inside that she couldn't quite solidify. She didn't know what they meant, and she hadn't felt them before, and somehow through the nebulousness of it all came this message that maybe being at that game was the right thing to do. And so without trying to think it through too much, she got on a bus and she rode to downtown Buffalo. She got a transfer and rode out to Lackawanna. Then she got off the bus and she walked to the stadium. She went into the stands, she looked out on the field, and she had arrived just in time to see Jimmy being carried off the field on a stretcher. he had hurt his back and had played his very last semi-pro game. Mary was not impressed. Jimmy was home for weeks recuperating. After 2 weeks, there was a knock on Mary's door one afternoon. It was Jimmy's older brother, Bernie. "Mary, why haven't you come by to see Jimmy?" Mary said, "Doesn't he have like a lot of girls taking care of him already?" Bernie said, "Well, send him a book, so one of those girls could read it to him. She did not go and see Jimmy. Well, weeks later, when he was fully recovered, Jimmy started hanging out at the soda shop again, and he and Mary continued dating. There were even those who called them a couple. But Mary didn't call them a couple. She still had those walls up. She was still determined not to invest any emotion into this relationship at all, because he was going to be gone at any moment, and she was having fun in the meantime. "Pookie, will you marry me?" That was the question she did not want to hear. She couldn't answer it. She couldn't say yes, because if she did, then the rest of the world would think that she was taking this seriously. They would have to start making wedding plans, and then long before any wedding would take place, Jimmy would be off like he was going to do. And so she couldn't say yes, but she couldn't say no either, because even though she said no to just about everything else Jimmy's ever asked her, if she said no to his proposal, she knew that that would be it, that he would say they were done and he would move on. And she realized that she didn't want them to be done that day, that, well, maybe she did kind of like him, and why couldn't they just go on the way they were until, somebody real came along and whisked him off, and so she couldn't say yes and she couldn't say no, and was there any other possibility? And she came up with one. It's what we in today's world call stringing someone along. And Mary thought that if she said yes to this, but then didn't make any plans toward a wedding or anything, then they could keep on doing what they've been doing until the inevitable happened. And so that's what she did. She said yes, and they did not make any wedding plans at all. She kept putting them off for over a year. And then it got to be January 1st, 1952. Jimmy sat Mary down and he said, "Look, we're supposed to be engaged." And she said, "Oh, we are, see? Yeah, we are." And he said, "Well, we need to set a date." And she goes, "Oh, we will," just like she had been doing for the past year, but Jimmy was having no more of it. He said, "Look, I don't think you're taking this seriously, and we need to set a date today. And if you won't do that, then we're done." And Mary got a little bit nervous, because she had to admit to herself again, she kind of liked this guy, and she liked hanging out with him and going out on dates and all of that. And why would it have to end that day? And she got a little bit rattled by this. And Jimmy said, "I want us to set a date. It can be your choice, any date you want. If something is sentimental to you or something is special, any date you want." And then Mary got a gleam in her eye, and Jimmy recognized that. He realized she was going to, really set a future date, and so he thought he'd rein it in a little bit. He said, "I want the date to be sometime this year." And Mary got that gleam in her eye again, and he realized she would put it off until, the very end of the year. So he thought he'd rein it in a little bit more, and he said, "You can pick any date you want before June 1st. And Mary burst into a big grin, and she got in his face, and she said, "May 31st. And they both proclaimed victory. Jimmy got a date, and Mary was able to put him off as far as his patience would go. And Jimmy was thrilled, thinking she was finally taking this seriously. And she figured that in 5 months' time, they will be finished, but she's had a good time through it all. And what was it he was saying? That she wasn't taking this seriously? She could take it seriously. Oh, you know what? On May 31st, there might just be a wedding. And that's the end of this story, but since you're not going to be able to hear the third story, I will wrap it up real quick and tell you that on May 31st, 1952, Jimmy and Mary did get married. And in the next 6 years, they had 3 children, a boy they named Clark, a boy they named Eric, and their firstborn, a daughter they named Denise. But for the first few years, my dad called me Little Pookie. Thank you.